You are now tuned in to the Storm Tracker Podcast.
Welcome back to the Storm Tracker Podcast. Marcus Benjamin here representing for CanesCounty.com, part of the Rivals.com network. Make sure you subscribe to the website, CanesCounty.com, for free. Use the promo code Miami30. Also subscribe to this YouTube channel, live from Canes County. It's a Blu Monday, and it's a new year. And so we are bringing in Larry Blustein, South Florida reporter, also reporting for Prep Red Zone, Florida as well, to really talk a little bit of Miami Hurricanes football and recruiting. Thanks for joining me today, Blue.
Good day. Thanks, Marcus. Happy New Year to you and all your great viewers and all the people who subscribe to you.
Happy New Year to you as well. This last year, I don't know for you, Blue, but this last year just kind of blew by for me. I can't believe it's 2025. I wrote it down the other day and I was like, wow, I can't believe it's 2025. But with a new year, we have new players on the roster for the Miami Hurricanes, and we also have new coaches as well. So we'll get into that. And you were at the Navy All-American Bowl and also at the Under Armour All-American game as well. So kind of want to get your insight on what you saw from Miami signees, targets, commits, and just just what to expect from those players. But first, let's talk about the big news that kind of came out this week, and that's Carson Beck committing to Miami. I mean, you and I, we watched this kid since high school. I watched him win a state championship for Jacksonville Mandarin, and played 2 years, or started 2 years, for Georgia. 2 impressive seasons for the Bulldogs, and he was going to go to the NFL, but like Cam Ward, he decides to stay in college for his final year. What do you think of move of Carson Beck coming to Miami?
Well, obviously it's a great move from experience standpoint, but like when you and I got together last time, we talked about how Miami continues to hunt for quarterbacks every year. It's going to kind of do some damage. I think that somebody like especially with Luke Nickel coming aboard and quality quarterbacks like that. Even Emory Williams, I know people are judging him off a half of a bowl that he really never even prepared much for. He didn't really realize that he would be able to be thrust into the game when it was a game. So people are going to continue to do that, and then he's going to go someplace else. He's going to be given a chance. He's going to mature, and then all of a sudden we're going to have another Brashard Smith on our hands, where the guy was the second leading rusher in the ACC. There's got to be a time sooner or later where you're going to have to ride with what you got. And Miami spent a lot of money to get Carson back, and not to say there's a billion pluses, but there's a billion negatives. And obviously the pluses are the experience factor, having an opportunity to bring in a guy like they did last year. As you mentioned, a guy was going to go to the NFL, somebody like Cam Ward. We're never going to see another Cam Ward. That's a fact. It took 200 years of football in Miami to even see somebody like that. So fans can kind of erase that and stop using that as a barometer, because you're not going to find another guy like that. But in Carson Beck, you have an experience, somebody's experienced at Luke Nickel and Jetty Anderson. And even if Emory does stay, which I'm not real sure that's a possibility, because, you have a guy that's been around, and not that I'm going to thrust him over anybody. I'm just saying you've got to give these kids more development, and that's what it's all about. The thing about the portal is that these kids, you're not developing the kids anymore. They're there, and you're bringing in people who are better, at the time, and you're not taking time to develop. But to answer your question, I think he's a great asset if healthy, and hopefully he will be. I just think that, and a lot of the negatives especially have been said, if he was the greatest quarterback in the world, A, he would have gone to the NFL, and B, he would still be at Georgia. So there's a lot of knocks on him in that way. I do realize that his girlfriend, one of the Cavender twins, does play at the University of Miami girls basketball, and I'm sure that was a a huge reason that he came here, to spend the year with her and, be in that same surroundings before he does go on to the NFL in the 26th draft. Yeah, he throws the ball real well, as you're watching here on your screen. But, you got to remember, Georgia football is still a cut above Miami. So they have more depth in a lot of places. So it made it easier for him, to kind of flourish. Now, when you lose the players that Miami lost, and let's face it, you're losing the all-time leading receiver in Xavier Restrepo, who kind of survived because of the fact that he made a lot of the quarterbacks look pretty good. Even Cam Ward, he made a lot of plays for Cam. And we know, in the past what he's done. So, he has to have these playmakers, and I understand Miami's adding a lot of people, but the very fact that he comes in and he's not going to be able to work out, till after spring, and that to me is a negative. Because you need, especially with all the new faces coming in, Marcus, and a lot of these guys that are stepping up, who were freshmen and sophomores last year, who really needed that. So now that it falls on, a freshman and Luke Nickel, and two young kids in Emory Williams and Judd Anderson, if, like I said, if that's the case. But that's the negative, that he's not going to be ready to go. And this is when we all found out a lot about Cam Ward last spring. If you remember in that spring game, he threw 423 yards, and we watched and go, oh my God, let's hurry up, August, hurry up and come. But this time you won't be able to do that. And that's a huge negative. I think it's a huge drawback because of the fact that this is a program that needed that. They needed that, when you transfer from one leadership to an next, that leadership has got to be ready and not just holding the clipboard and say, well, if I was in there, this is what I would do. So that's the huge negative. Obviously, his experience and, being around high level football is a positive. So like I said, for the million positives, there's a million negatives in the situation, but I guess that could be said for anybody. When you have guys like, who he had to throw, like Bowers, who was obviously one of the best tight ends in the NFL this year, young for the Raiders. When then you had all those receivers and you had running backs, that he had, and an offensive line that was double what Miami has. Although I think Miami's offensive line will be one of the best, if not the best in the country this year. But that was the emphasis. But my feeling on Carson Beck, let's wait and see. He's got to be healthy, and it's real hard to come in and be a leader if you haven't led at that place before. We all know him, but his teammates, they don't know much about him, and other than watching him. So let's see what happens. Let's see what develops. But you're going to have to develop another quarterback for the future, definitely. And that's I heard the other day that was one of the drawbacks. And I've agreed with that all along, that you've got to develop what you got. I mean, and that's the important part.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about the whole development part on that. I really kind of wanted to talk about that as well. I mean, obviously you won't have Carson Beck for the spring, so you're going to have a chance to develop Judd Anderson. We're going to see probably the most that we've seen of Judd Anderson, if indeed Emory Williams does transfer out, which is what we're expecting. I think we're just wondering if he's going to transfer now, which he still has a chance to, or if he is going to wait until that spring window to jump into the transfer portal. He may want to put some more tape on film in the spring game and in practice for his next location. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of what they do at quarterback in the spring. Right. And we're going to get to see Luke Nickel as well. Luke Nickel moved in to the University of Miami, just like a lot of other freshmen over the weekend. So we may get to see him a lot as well in the spring because, if Emory Williams does leave, that's going to leave just two scholarship quarterbacks, available scholarship quarterbacks on the roster. So I think it's somewhat of an issue, though, that you do get a transfer quarterback every year because what kind of message does that send to recruits? Is that, the deal? I mean, we've seen that at center now as well. And we've seen, centers and also other offensive linemen leave the program Like, for example, Antonio Tripp, who was a center at IMG that was hoping to maybe start maybe next season, is likely not, because they bring in a TCU transfer like they brought in an Indiana transfer the year before and a UCF transfer the year prior. So
Right.
I do think it's somewhat of an issue. But I think after this year, I think Miami should go with the quarterbacks that they have. Go with the quarterbacks that they develop. If indeed Judd Anderson stays with the program, if he also leaves the program, then you probably do have to add another transfer quarterback as well. If you're just going to stick with the one, Darion Coleman, for the 2026 class. So um, I totally agree with you, Blue. I think it should be, it will be an issue kind of down the line here, but definitely excited to see what Carson Beck does
Sure.
in the in the summer, when once he's healthy. The other big move, of course, it was defensive coordinator. Blue, Corey Heatherman, hired from Minnesota after Lance Guidry was, you know, departed from the program. Before we kind of get into that, I did want to just kind of get your overall view of the 2024 season. I mean, Mario Cristobal, third year, the end of the season. I didn't really get a chance to speak to you after the bowl game. What is your assessment of this season, the 2024 season? Obviously, 10 wins. Cristobal has improved year after year. Went from 5-7 to 7-5, and now 10 wins in the third year. Do you feel like it was a success? What is your overall perception of the 2024 season?
Well, you can never throw away 10 wins, obviously. I mean, that's always a season that a lot of people realistically would take. I think that the fans kind of set the bar a lot higher. After they won the game against Florida, they figured, you know what? We didn't just go to Gainesville and win. We just blew out an SEC team. Although at the time, we felt that SEC team was on the spin and their head coach would make it past the 4 or 5 games. But as we learned, they came out probably feeling a lot better than of themselves than Miami did when the season ended. I mean, they finished the way they did. They won those games, rightfully so. With the healthy quarterback, they could have won Tennessee and they could have won against Georgia, and then they would have had the 9-10 wins. But I think there's a lot of ways to look at Miami. The unfortunate thing is a lot of your playmakers are departing. But that's going to happen every year. So you have to adjust your mindset now. And I feel that Syracuse game pretty much soured the entire season, because I think that they really had that opportunity to win that game and then get into the ACC championship game and then all of a sudden be in that group of 12. As we learned, Miami could have done pretty good in that little mix. I mean, obviously defense wasn't a key for Miami, and that hurts. But you got to be satisfied. 10-win season, but you can't rest on that 10 wins. And you've got to keep, as you mentioned, every year, Coach Cristobal has made the necessary adjustments, personnel-wise and coaching-wise, to up the ante. And now this year with Notre Dame and Florida to begin the year, and I was at the Orange Bowl and I saw Notre Dame, and they're pretty damn good. You have an opportunity now in this offseason, as we've seen with the portal. They started building pretty well, but you got to start using those guys from the 24 and 25 recruiting classes, because those were deemed top 10, top 5 type of classes. And I thought that was the thing that separated Miami from an FSU the last couple of years, because while FSU 2 years ago hit on the portal, they didn't do so last year, and they had nobody to rely on because their recruiting classes were average at best, because they never hit on the big kids that they thought that they would hit on. So my thing is, Miami comes out, they go in the spring, and they've got to start utilizing some of these studs that they got in the 24 and 25 classes to kind of put a stamp on what the recruiting process, because whenever you talk about Mario Cristobal, the first thing comes out of everybody's mind, Marcus, is he's a great recruiter. Well, now let's see some of those recruits pan out so he could, justify that tag.
Yeah, absolutely. Miami obviously had one of the most prolific offenses in the history of the program in the 2024 season. But that wasn't the issue. Obviously, the obvious issue was the defense was not able to stop the other offense. And like you mentioned in that Syracuse game, where it kind of, derailed, any chance of course, them getting to the ACC championship game. So they get rid of Lance Guidry, a defensive coordinator, and they bring in now a Corey Heatherman. What do you think about just that whole transition? Do you think Guidry deserved another year, or was this the right time? And is Heatherman the right guy for the job?
Yeah, well, you flash back a couple of years ago when we were asking the same question about Guidry. Is he the right guy for the job? You have to have personnel. And that's the one thing, because there's not going to be a lot of coaches that are going to come into any situations, Nick Saban included, if you don't have personnel. And Miami showed against Florida A&M and Florida and Ball State that they had a really good front seven, but then it all disappeared. And, it was one of those perfect storms on a negative way that your linebackers had unproductive years. You were in a situation where you had a lot of guys that were like, here's Kiko Mawanoa, didn't have anywhere near the year that he had the year before. Their front seven really kind of dwindled. Bain started, was injured for the early part of the campaign. All those guys that you brought in, like Stinson and Barrow, never really clicked after the first couple of games of the year. So what happened, and that made the secondary pretty much a huge target. Look at a lot of these programs, and I don't care who they are, but if your front seven play is really good, your secondary is a lot better. Miami's front seven wasn't that good, so their secondary was exposed. So that's the thing. You do what you can do, and building. And if Corey comes in here and he could, put together a defensive schemes, because let me tell you, you can't blame Guidry for everything. And I said that all year. He worked hard during his practice sessions to put kids in the right place to make the plays. Now, if they didn't make them, that wasn't always on him. Now, obviously, there's calls and schemes that maybe he could have changed along the way and maybe used more of the strengths of what he had rather than what he didn't have. He kind of blew I think he kind of boilerplated the defense and said, well, this guy's going to play here. This guy's going to, we're not going to make that many adjustments because we don't have the personnel to make those adjustments. And I think that's what happened in the Syracuse game. That definitely happened in the Iowa State game. They couldn't stop them. And it didn't matter how many adjustments you made. If you don't have personnel, you don't have personnel. So in essence, somebody has to be the scapegoat. And I think that Corey Hetherington's coming into a situation where he's going to have to right the ship, or he'll be in the same situation. So he, and I think too that your position coaches, you can't just give them free passes. I know Jason Taylor, and now obviously your defensive tackle coach moved on to his alma mater at Arizona. So your linebacking, Nicholson has to step it up. Your defensive secondary has to step it up. And they're all part of this thing. And that's the one thing that a few years ago, you had an offensive coordinator who'd never listened to a quarterback coach or a running back coach. He did things his way. Well, that can't be. You have to have input, and that's why you have team meetings. And I think that your new DC is going to have to step it up, Marcus, and be able to listen and get input from the rest of the position coaches, because they see these kids a lot closer than they do, and they know what they're capable of. So, yeah, to answer your question, I think he'll do really well. He's just got to, implement things in place, and I'm not necessarily going to come down and come down on Guidry 100%, because there were some things that you kind of like shook your head at. But you know what? If the kids don't make the play, you just can't continue to blame him for it.
Yeah, that's what I've been communicating as well to people who ask me about it as well, is that these kids they got to make the plays. I mean, they're the players on the field, and they have to make the plays. And I think Guidry did pretty well as far as scheme is concerned. I like what he did the year prior, where he switched up to a 3-3 look, and I think that really kind of helped to have the three linebackers. Corey Heatherman puts an emphasis on the linebacking group, so I want to see if he would switch that up as well and play three linebackers instead of the two. I think a lot of the times there was just a lot of space for these other teams to really kind of make plays due to just having the two linebackers instead of the three. So that's something to watch. But Heatherman comes in here with last year being the 5th ranked total defense for Minnesota.
Yeah.
In the regular season, the Gophers allowed 290.9 total yards per game, which ranked 8th, 178.3 passing yards per game, which ranked 15th, and 112 rushing yards per game, which ranked 23rd. So he will definitely have.
But also, Marcus, too, remember this, he had different personnel. And that's the thing, I mean, let's see what happens. I mean, PJ Fleck has done a great job at Minnesota, and a guy who lets his coaches coach. He always has. He comes out of the Greg Schiano tree. So obviously, he knows defense, and let's see what happens. But you have to have the personnel. I don't care who it is coming in. I mean, look at, not to take anything away and go to the Dolphins, but look at Vic Fangio. Here's a guy that was the guru of gurus of all time, and he never really did a great job with the Dolphins. It comes down to personnel. Obviously, when you got all those studs like he has at Philadelphia, what a difference things make. But give him that leash. Let's see what happens. But he's going to be under a short leash, and he's going to be under a microscope, because there's a lot of fans and obviously a lot of people who follow Miami, are kind of fed up. When is the right guy going to come along? Who is the right guy? What is it going to take? So he has to understand that he's coming in here, and there's going to be very few free passes, because they've all been given out over the last couple of years.
Yeah, totally agree with you there as well. And today in college football, it's all about the aesthetics and how things look. The fact that you had the number one offense and you're not able to make the playoff is just not a good look. So I think that's why, or part of the reason why, Cristobal decided to make the move that he did. You talked about personnel, and they did bring in some players from the transfer portal in this window. We already talked about Carson Beck, obviously, but there are a ton of other guys that they brought in, especially on the defensive back front. And they also brought in a center as well, tight end. So they did address some needs. When you look at some of these transfers that have come in, Larry, which transfer gets you most excited?
Well, you got a few of them, obviously. When you take a look at the, some of the guys that came in at the end of the year, that started this new year, by coming in. I think you take a look at some of the guys that, especially as you mentioned, look at you got coming back in the secondary. I mean, O.J. Frederick had an awesome year. You have Zaquan Patterson moving in, Markeith Williams. You have guys like that, Dylan Day and Damari Brown, that obviously you had on the roster from last year, who did an awesome job. But I mean, to pinpoint one guy right now, there's a lot of names. Obviously, the young man from out in California was huge. To get and you take a look at I'm just trying to think of some names. Shoot out some names, and I'll tell you a little bit about them while I'm thinking.
How about Charles Brantley?
Yes, kid that I had a chance to watch for 3 years at Venice High School before he went to Michigan State. I think he's a big advantage, but again, something has to happen up front. So these secondary kids, are not going to be on an island, by themselves. And that's the one thing that's going to be important, for somebody like a Brantley, who like you said, I mean, I like the guy. I think he's one of those guys, the kid, David Blaine, LA, I think, comes to mind too. Big lineman, like
Yeah.
in the Charles Brandley situation, because what I remember him, from high school, he's, 6 foot, 170, 175. I think he's going to be one of those guys. There's Zachariah Poyser, who came from Jacksonville State. I think he's going to be another guy, on that defensive side of the ball. They got a few kids that I think are going to be Ethan O'Connor. That's another kid that came in that I believe he has an opportunity. So you have some players on the defensive side that came in, that transferred in. As I mentioned, the Blake kid who's like 6'4", 300 something pounds. Somebody like that could come in. But I'm also excited about the offensive guys that they brought in, because you lost some key wide receivers. I mean, we knew they were going to lose, Xavier Restrepo, but we know that they were going to lose somebody who I thought, last year was one of the guys that, that stepped up in a lot of games. And, so, I mean, and then you got CJ Daniels coming in, who I think's got an opportunity to step right in. You had mentioned, on the offensive line with the kid James Brockermeyer, who came from TCU, a big steady guy. You added to the tight end room, Jake Nickel, Luke's brother, who came in. And I just think that we have to play on a lot of the recruits that came in. I think that a lot of these recruits, like Malachi Tony, I think he's a plug and play guy. You and I talked about this a bunch. I mean, Chris Johnson was a nice kid and he got a lot of speed, but he was a horrible kick returner. All he did was get the ball, run 30 yards into somebody's back. With Malachi Tony, that doesn't happen. He breaks it out and he knows how to read wedges. Guys like that are plug and plays, like an OJ Frederick was last year.
Yeah.
Those are the guys that you count on, because Miami's not done anywhere near done in the recruiting. I mean, in the portal. Yeah. So we know that they're going to add, another DB or so. They're going to add maybe another linebacker or a pass rusher. But let's not forget, you still have Popo from last year, who showed a lot as a linebacker. Bryant, who also showed. So these are the guys that have to start stepping up, because remember, in this age of the portal and transfers, you may not have them very long. You may have these guys for a year or two before they get a better deal to go someplace else. And that's just the lay of the land now. It's just, so that's how you have to do it. You don't have a big board anymore. You just have to, fly by the seat of your pants, because you don't know who's going to, in the off season, get a deal from somebody else to go and, play somewhere else. It's happening not just here, but everywhere. You look at last year, and every damn game you watch, there's somebody that said, well, that guy was in Indiana last year. Here, in bringing Indiana, here's a perfect example. Indiana came up last year and had a great year, the best year they've ever had. Well, think about this. Kirk Cignetti brought 13 kids with him from James Madison. Okay. And of those 13, 12 go. And then last year, of the team that he had, 37 kids will leave. So there's 49 players from a team like Indiana. Who's going to be Arizona State this next year? Who's going to be Indiana? Who's going to be Boise? See, and that's what we look at every year. Yeah, your Alabamas and Notre Dames and school, and even Alabama and Georgia. At the beginning of the year, if I sat there and you and I were talking, and I said, well, Alabama and Georgia are going to lose 7 games, you're going to go, what? Over what? How many years? Not the same year. So it's all changed. So you have to be diligent, and you have to be, I think you have to have a better eye for talent than you ever had before. And that's what I'm saying. You have to be able to see in these Malachi Tonys, because if Malachi doesn't play a playoff game, we wouldn't have seen what he has totally. We wouldn't have known that when he went up against Darian Coleman in the state championship game, that he actually looked like the better recruit at quarterback. 15 completions in a row, that type of thing. That's why I tell these people who do recruiting, you got to see these players. You just can't all of a sudden go off a film and say, oh, yeah, he could play. Yeah, right. You got to see there's more intangibles, than that. And that's why, when I learned how to do this, Marcus, years and years and years ago, it was by going places. It wasn't by sitting home and watching video or listening to somebody say, oh, that guy could catch you. Wait till he gets on campus. those are the things that Mario Cristobal has always had strengths in, being able to evaluate talent from the beginning. Now, as people will find out and people will agree, you got a coach now. That's the one knock on him now is that, yeah, okay, you could recruit and you got these kids, but can you develop them and coach? And that's, and that's the one thing I told you. The first conversation I had with Mario Cristobal in the May of when he came here, we were talking, and he asked me, he says, I see Miami from afar, got all these kids, over the years. And they were really good. He goes, what happened? I said, well, they were never coached up. And he said to me, and he looked at me in straight face, and he goes, that'll never happen here. Well, that has to start being implemented. Miami needs to start coaching these kids up. They need to start, making sure that they develop. And, in replacing them with the Carson Becks and people like that every year is not going to get it done. And I'm not going to take shots at Carson Beck I understand that they need to bring somebody in. They needed to bring in Reese Paffenbarger last year, and they needed to bring all these guys in there. But, sooner or later, you're going to have to go on your own judgment and understand that a Judd Anderson or a Luke Nickel or Emory Williams were guys that you coveted. I mean, you coveted them enough to, make them a big priority in your signing classes. So now, let's make something of it. Let's work with them. Let's, that just because Emory Williams had a bad second half against Iowa State in the bowl game, you can't just throw him off, and you just can't write him off. You got to work with him and and play to his strengths. We all saw him in some of the spring scrimmages. The guy's got an arm, but he's just like anybody else. If you don't have experience, I don't care. You're not going to be, but you got to be able to strike with one of these guys sooner or later. You can't keep playing a roulette game, because if you're going to do that, you may not. You're not going to 100 billion%. You're not going to come up with another Cam Ward, so you might as well take that off the board.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Miami should develop their guys at the edge position because you got a ton of edges that are kind of ready to just kind of go, I think.
Right. And a great coach to teach them too.
Right, exactly. And that's key too. If they're able to retain some of these guys on the defensive coaching side, then I think a lot of these guys stay and get developed because, to be honest, a lot of these edges are here for Jason Taylor. He was definitely someone who was key in a lot of those guys' recruitment. The Marquise Lightfoots, the Justin Scotts, the Coma Conathys, like I mentioned, the Booker Pickett's. These guys need to be developed, and I think Miami has enough guys at edge to go into that 2025 season. Maybe you add one more edge just for depth purposes in the spring window if a big name drops into the portal. And I think at linebacker, I think he has some very capable guys as well. I think Bobby Pruitt has a ton of potential, as well as, you mentioned Popo, who's likely going to play a ton of snaps next season. And, you still have players like Aldarius Hayes as well. Bobby Washington still on the roster as well. I think they did well when it comes to the secondary as far as addressing it and adding depth there, since you lost some guys. You lost to Robert Stafford. You lost to Jaden Harris. So you lost to Mish Powell, obviously, to the NFL draft. So you want to add guys to that secondary, of course. But I think receiver is still kind of a question because you lost all your top four guys. That usually doesn't happen. You're losing Jacoby George, Restrepo, Sam Brown, and Isaiah Horton. That
was the name I was thinking of before.
Yeah, you lose all four guys. You bring in a CJ Daniels, but you bring in you're going to play a lot of guys who don't have a ton of snaps. JoJo, who's got all the talent in the world. Ray, yet to see the explosive Ray that we saw at Miami Edison in the orange and green. And then you got a Chance Robinson, Robinson, who hasn't played yet, and Nikar, who hasn't really played a ton as well. So you're expecting some young, inexperienced guys to really kind of step up here with a brand new quarterback. So that does cause some concern on the go forward. So we'll see who else they do add from the transfer portal in the spring window, because in the spring window is where Miami really did well last season,
Yes.
bringing in a Damian Martinez and a Tyler Barron and, you know, Simeon Barrow and others in that spring window, which ended up being very key players for the 2024 season. Lastly, before I let you go, Blue, I know you've been kind of on the road. You were in San Antonio for the Navy All-America game. You were also in Orlando for the Under Armour All-American game as well. There are a few signees, commits, and recruiting targets that Miami is involved with, including Hayden Lowe, who was at the All-American game, and Jordan Campbell at the Under Armour All-American game. What players among the signees, commits, targets really kind of stood out to you?
Well, obviously Jordan Campbell, and you and I talked about it. I mean, this is a kid that, you know, this is the first year in both games, the Under Armour game and the Navy All-American game, that they let juniors play, which I think is a great idea. You know, I mean, it gives these kids an opportunity, you know, gives college coaches an opportunity to see these guys a year before. I mean, they're not just going to throw in anybody, but they're going to throw in kids who are, you know, like up and above. And certainly Jordan Campbell led the way in tackles. I think he had 6 or 7 tackles for his team, came up with a couple of big plays. You and I talked before. Maybe he might not be a recruit, a target now, but Naheem Burrows, a kid from the Jacksonville Bulls, who I thought kind of also stole the show. Another guy who, you know, right now may not be on the immediate radar, but let's look at it. He's close to home, and that's the kid Derek Cooper. I mean, I think that Derek Cooper might have accelerated faster than anybody I've ever covered. He went from basically nobody knew about him. Now, I knew about him from youth football, but when he was at Cardinal Gibbons in Fort Lauderdale, a lot of Matt DeBuck and the coaching staff favored a senior over him, so he didn't get as much playing time. But during the spring last year when he came over, he went from a no-star to a 5-star. And I've never seen that happen before, only because of the fact that he's 6'1.5", he's 209, 210 pounds. And here's a guy against Fort Lauderdale St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, everybody out there knows, you know, they're 6-time defending state champions, you know, guys like Michael Irvin and the Bosa brothers and on and on and on. He ran for 147 yards against them and had 15 tackles in the same game. So that shows you somebody like that, what he's capable of. And I think that, you know, you had a lot of other targets that were juniors in the game, in both games, that, you know, Miami could latch onto. And the thing is because of the way things are now, you can never close the book on anybody, because someone could go someplace for a year or two, and then all of a sudden in the next cycle, you got them back. So live for today. And that's what I'm saying. And that's why Miami's got to start living for today rather than living for the future and, you know, say, well, if this guy does. No, he's good, because what's going to happen, he's going to become Brashard Smith. And they're going to see that Brashard could play running back at SMU, where obviously he's always been a really good, talented kid, but then all of a sudden he comes in and was arguably one of the best running backs in the ACC this last year. Yeah. Desmond Reed, who came from Miramar, Miami, and everybody just completely ignored him like he was, you know, like he was nothing. He goes to Western Carolina, then goes to Pittsburgh and is one of the top running backs in the ACC when you had him in your own backyard. The kid Jordan Facet from Notre Dame, wide receiver, was recruited to Notre Dame for lacrosse out of Pinecrest High School. Yeah, and nobody wants him. Arguably, at the end of the year, top 2-3 receiver that the Fighting Irish had. So you can't let a lot of these guys get out of your backyard. I mean, you've got to really put a big press on them. And I know that they've added a lot of, you know, people in the recruiting department with Frank Tucker and people like that. But the thing is now you got to remember the negative about some of that is a lot of those recruiting people can't go to games. They can't go to camps. They can't go to combines. So you've got to be very diligent when you look at guys and you understand that there's more to it than the X's and O's. A lot of these kids, you know, there's kids that are quick developers. OJ Frederick. We watched him at Deerfield, watch him at St. Thomas, and then all of a sudden, he's arguably one of the best defensive backs, freshman defensive backs in the country. And now he comes back, and you arguably he's going to be all ACC preseason. He's got to be, because he's like one of the most productive. But that's what you need. If Luke Nichols going to strike gold in his first year, whether you have a quarterback there or not, he's got to be one of those guys. How do you develop? How the Jaden Daniels of this world, and how do guys like that become who they are? Well, they're given an opportunity to develop. And that's the whole thing. And I'm not saying walk in and take a 17-year-old freshman and put him up against Notre Dame in your opening game. But keep in mind that you've got to give these guys every opportunity to compete for jobs, and along the way, use your quarterback coach. You got Dawson. He's a really good offensive mind. Well, develop your quarterbacks. If you need to bring in a quarterback coach, which they had before in Frank Ponce, you got to do it, because then it takes a lot of the burden off of your offensive coordinator, and it puts it on your quarterback coach to help develop while the offensive coordinator is developing the entire offense. That's just my opinion. It might not be a valid opinion, but it's just the way that I see things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of guys I kind of want to see develop in 2025 are, Jordan Lyle. I want to see him take it to the next level. Mark Fletcher, you kind of want to see him take it to the next level. Elijah Lofton, you kind of want to see this guy take it to the next level, be used in different areas and different packages as well. And, just like all the edges that I mentioned earlier, you want to see a kind of develop, take it to the next level. And the linebacking core, you kind of want to see guys like Aldarius Hayes and Bobby Pruitt. You want to see those guys develop to the next level.
Yeah.
Amari Brown,
I agree.
Obviously missed most of the season last year due to injury, but you kind of want to see him take it to the next level, because he's likely going to be your CB1 going into next year. So you kind of want to see a guy like that develop as well, to really kind of just show that you can develop at Miami for future classes, of course. That's Larry Blustein joining me. He writes for Prep Red Zone Florida. Make sure you check out his stuff there. And he's also on the radio as well, 560 WQAM, with the high school football report as well. Thank you for joining me today, this morning.
Anytime. Happy New Year to you and everybody.
Happy New Year to you as well, Blue. And we will talk soon, of course. We got Battle Miami coming up this weekend, so I'm sure I'll see you out there. I'm excited to see all the recruits out there. Maybe we can circle back and talk about all the players that we've seen during this 7-on-7 season, because we're going to be in the thick of it in the next couple of weeks. So I'm excited to see all the players from the 7-on-7 circuit. That's going to wrap it up for the Storm Tracker podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the website, canescounty.com, for free. Use the promo code Miami30, and also subscribe to this YouTube channel live from Canes County. Also subscribe to this podcast on all platforms. Until the next episode.